Hey guys, it's Nick, the real story of TulipMania, part 2, right now. So, TulipMania, the real story. If you haven't seen part 1, then go up and watch part 1 now. Otherwise, let's continue with our story. Imagine you are a wealthy merchant. More specifically, a wealthy merchant in the Dutch Republic in the late 1500s, early 1600s. You've grown in wealth. You want to start showing off this wealth to your friends and family by starting a collection. Maybe you want to get some tulips. In fact, you definitely want to get some tulips. But they're kind of hard to get a hold of. There's not a lot going around, and of course the ones that are most desired are the most rare, and so it's kind of hard to actually get your hands on any tulips. How do you go about doing it? Well, this leads to the rise of some ungentlemanly methods. One of the things that people do, they steal flowers from each other all the time. Like, it's funny how much this goes on. It's like, you want a flower garden and don't really want to spend the time or money to actually do it, just steal it from somebody else, you know. It's just like, so that's one method. The one that's economically more important to our story, though, is the different characters that start to get involved. One of the first characters are called the rhizotome, or the root cutters, basically. These are people who kind of travel around in the countryside, and they basically find tulips that are growing wild, and they dig them up, and they bring them back, and they sell them. Right? This is good in that it helps increase supply, but for the people buying them, they really don't know what they're buying because it's really hard to tell one tulip bulb from another. So there's a lot of fraud that goes on, so these guys kind of have an unsavory reputation in terms of actually giving you the product that you want. Some other guys that come in are the apothecaries. You can kind of imagine these guys as like early modern pharmacists. They kind of sold you stuff that would fix your ills, you know. In their travels around the countryside as well, they would run into tulips and they would dig them up and bring them back and sell them. They kind of had an unsavory reputation because a lot of their places kind of doubled as like speakeasies or like, you know, secret drinking dens. Sometimes they give medical evaluations, even though that was definitely not what their job was supposed to be. And of course, why does this always happen? They sold the tulips as aphrodisiacs. You know what this bulb is good for? Your bulb. I wonder if the advertising at that point in time was like two people sitting in a bathtub with a tulip bulb in the middle between them. Just saying. So anyway, in the 1600s, we really start to see a market start to form for tulips. And we see a number of people on the supply side, right, increasing the supply of tulips. Because as we discussed previously, it's kind of hard to get the tulip to increase in any number due to how they reproduce. So on the one hand, you have the rhizotome, the apothecaries. You also have the connoisseurs who are adding to this amount of tulips in circulation. The commercial growers. Additionally, you also have the fact that the tulip actually grows really easily in the United Provinces or the Dutch Republic. The tulip likes poor soil, and the Dutch Republic just happens to have a lot of poor soil. I was going to say a different word, but we're keeping this family friendly. So on the other side, we have the demand side, right? So there's the things that we already talked about how this is becoming an item of collecting, the fact that it does change, that it's spontaneous when it changes, the novelty aspect, right? There's a lot of items over here that are the reason why people want the tulips. A few of the interesting new aspects is there was a lot of money coming into the Dutch Republic at this time period, right? You know, the Spanish would rob the Native Americans, and then the Dutch would rob the Spanish on their way back. Of course, they're also trading with the East Indies at this point in time, and then they would sell that stuff to people in Europe, and that would bring in a ton of money. They actually established the Bank of Amsterdam at this point in time, which is like one of the first deposit banks and really just helps smooth out all the currency issues because there's tons of debasement of currency at this point in time, and a ton of money just starts flowing into the Dutch Republic because of this bank as well. Of course, the more money you have to spend on tulips, for example. So this helps increase the amount of demand that's going into this luxury good. Additionally, you have a lot of new forces that are coming in. You have a lot of what we call economic refugees, right? The Dutch Republic is still basically fighting its war to remain a separate country, you know, basically a revolutionary war against the Spanish. During this war, they've actually blockaded the Spanish part of the Netherlands, called conveniently the Spanish Netherlands. And you see a lot of merchants down there who were living in port towns, who are earning a lot of money and doing pretty well, and then the economy just tanks basically. And they're like, yeah, you know what, I don't really like the Spanish that much anyway, and now I can't really make money here anymore. So I'm just gonna go up to the Dutch Republic and take all my money, my tulips, and all my trade contacts, and kind of everything I own up there too. All right, see ya. right? Like they start coming up at this point in time. Of course, they're bringing all their stuff, including their tulip bulbs, but they're also bringing their aristocratic taste, which means more demand. So they're adding to both the supply and demand side of this as well. Additionally, we see the rise of what we basically call the traders, right? They're the people who maybe don't really care about the tulip as much for its beauty, but they, see that it's a way to make money at this point in time. Now, there's a big crossover between the traders and the people who just grow tulips, the connoisseurs. There's a lot of people who are one and the same thing, although they like to pretend that they're all connoisseurs and stuff like that. So, a lot of that stuff going on. In order to actually understand who was actually involved in this, imagine that you are a tulip trader, right? You're one of these people that you have a primary gig, but you also like, talking about tulips. This is something that's just fun for you. You do it on the side, basically. Who would you get involved with on a daily basis, right? So you imagine you wake up in the morning, talk to your family, hang out. Maybe you talk to them about how the tulips are doing, how they're going to do next year, stuff like that. You see a lot of families be involved in tulip tradings. It's how information is spreading. You head out. Your first stop is to the baker to pick up some bread, get some food. Maybe you talk to him about tulips and how they're doing. Then maybe you stop at the shopkeeper, buy some wares, stuff you need, stuff like that. Again, talk to him about tulips. Maybe you go out for the day and you start doing your normal business stuff and your normal trade contacts. You would talk to them about, how it's business, stuff like that. But you'd also talk about how tulips doing. Then maybe at the end of the day, before you head home, you head to your local inn/tavern, have a few drinks. You talk to, kind of everybody there about tulips, how they're doing. You see kind of networks of people clustering around certain taverns about talking about tulips and how they're doing, who sold what for what, how much, etc. And then maybe occasionally you see your doctor and talk to him about tulips. So you see basically who the traders interact with and who these people are who are raising tulips, who they interact with are the people who end up getting involved in the trade. And contrary to popular opinion, that's not everybody, right? It's not the chimney sweep, it's not the baker's wife, it's not the nobleman. It's just people who have access to this information, who actually start buying and selling tulips on a regular basis. And what we find is they reside in the city and they're basically middle class, what we might call upper the middle class. They have a primary business, which is like baking or shopkeeping or something like that. But then they also trade tulips on the side, maybe for fun. Hopefully they make some money at the same time. But it's not their main gig. One of the other aspects that's really, really interesting is how they're traded at this point in time. There's a lot of trades, the kind of, standard boring stuff happens in people's gardens and at homes and stuff like that. But one of the coolest ones is when it happens at a tavern or the inn, or basically your local pub or bar, right? And the experience that was just so common back then, it's hard for us to imagine today. First of all, before you walked into the tavern, you'd be asked to surrender your weapons at the door. You imagine that guy who has like 4 different knives on him. He's like, oh wait, give me a sec. So then once you get inside, basically, you have to imagine it's almost like your grandma's house, right? It's just, there's a lot of coziness, low lights kind of thing. The only difference is that everyone's smoking. And not specifically just like a little bit of smoke. Like the whole room is hotboxed with smoke. Smoking is a huge thing during this time period, and it's thought to have cured all sorts of ailments, including keeping you safe from the plague. Of course, they didn't smoke cigars. They actually had long pipes that they would smoke out of at the time, but you get the idea. So the whole, your grandma's house, you surrender your weapons at the door, very cozy. Additionally, museum quality artwork hanging on the walls. Stuff that we would hang in museums today is just hanging on the walls. And it's like yellowing because of all the smoke here. And, and of course, since it's in, everyone would also be drinking. Then even once you got inside, how you actually traded it was like interesting in and of itself. And again, this comes from a story that was basically propaganda against the trade. So we need to take it with a lot of salt, but you'll get the idea. Basically, the first step when you walk in is don't be honest. Don't say like, hey, I want to buy some tulips. Anybody know where I can buy some tulips? You basically have to like drop super veiled hints until somebody basically gets it. You have to say like, I have a lot of whites, but I would like some yellows, and stuff like that for a long time until someone's like, oh, you want to buy some tulips? All right, yeah, let's go. And then buyer and seller would basically be handed this board in which they were to write their bids and asks on. Ah, thank you. And they'd be given a piece of chalk. And so basically you had to go and you imagine they'd be sitting across the table from one another. One person would write what they're willing to buy at, another person would write what they're willing to sell at. Then they basically give the boards to 2 other people. Those 2 people would go off and discuss the prices and try to figure out what they think is a fair price. Meanwhile, you have the buyer and seller just sitting across from each other at the table. Then the boards would be handed back to them with the new price written on it. Thank you. The buyer and seller would both look at it, and the offer could be accepted or rejected from there. And so you just get a totally different idea of, modern stock market. We buy and sell. We don't even see each other on computers. Just imagine, like, in order to buy a stock, you basically have to go to like a smoke inundated bar and then have a private negotiation with somebody about a stock that's going to do. Meanwhile, you're drinking at the same time. And it's just like the totally different aspect of this market that doesn't even play into it today. Caveat, historians don't really think that much trading actually ended up taking place here, or at least Annie Goldgar doesn't think that much trading actually ended up taking place at taverns. It definitely happened, but it's not as much as we're led to believe by the accounts that were handed down. And we have to remember at this point in time, tulips are starting to develop into a futures market. This is one of the other really unique aspects at this point in time. The futures market has actually been created about 30 years ago by the Dutch to deal with the risks of the Baltic grain trade, but it starts getting applied to tulips because of the necessity of how tulips grow. Basically, tulips are planted in the fall, and then they grow during the fall, the winter, and then they bloom in spring for like 2 weeks basically, and then they start dying and they go dormant, and then in the summer they're dug up and they're preserved for what's known as the dry bulb time. The only time you can really exchange, like a normal exchange that we'd think about, is during the summer. This is when the bulbs are out of the ground, when you can just say, here's your bulb and I'll take your money, right? This is the only time when really bulbs can be traded like that. If you want to buy bulbs any other time during the year, you basically have to trade a futures contract. You have to say, hey, I know we can't dig up this bulb now, but I want to buy it from you in the summer, and I'll buy it from you for 1,000 guilders. Does that sound good? They say okay. And then basically, sometimes they write it down, sometimes they're not, but basically it's kind of like a gentleman's agreement, right? The summer comes around, and they give them the money, they give them the tulip, and it's good. But for that 6 months until the summer comes around, it's basically a futures contract. And they do this to get around the seasons at the time. But we'll see that this ends up causing problems because it's kind of a gentleman's agreement of sorts. Yes, they write it down a lot of the time, sometimes they don't, but there's no way to enforce it. Imagine having a futures market without the protections of a modern futures market, right? This is kind of the beginning, right? You're starting to learn to ride a bike without the training wheels, right? And people fall and they hurt themselves. A futures market isn't just created and everybody loves it. There's actually a backlash against the futures market. It's seen as immoral, that you're not selling goods that you currently have to sell, and it's seen as a form of gambling. And gambling is so prevalent at this point in time, it's hard to kind of wrap our minds around it. Rembrandt, the famous artist, was one of 100 people to gamble that he would be alive next year. In 1624, this guy bet that he could sail a trough meant for kneading dough that amounts to what we would think of as a wooden bathtub down a very dangerous river, and he ended up winning the bet. The Dutch would bet on the outcome of wars, they bet on the outcome of battles. Supposedly one bet over a tulip bulb got so intense that when the loser died, the winner took his widow to court in order to get the tulip bulb. Gambling's very prevalent at this point in time. A lot of authors have argued that the tulip kind of fed into this form of gambling that, hey, we're betting on everything else, why not bet on a tulip? And in some sense, it's kind of hard not to see that argument, but we have to remember this is an era that's fraught with risk in every direction. Literally, you could die of the plague, your city could get sacked, you could get stabbed one day. Literally, this is an era where there are so many risks that it's hard for us to contemplate today. I love this one example by Annie Goldgar, the historian, who talks about just the risks involved in overseas trade at this point in time. Besides the unpredictability of supply, the uncertainty of markets, and the inability to get speedy information, overseas traders had to face the simple problems of transport. Ships were not built to endure some of the conditions they faced. The risk of shipwreck was always high, and storms were not the only danger. Pirates took a heavy toll in sunken or captured ships, and sailors held for ransom. In 1928, a Dutch or English ship was captured or sunk by Dunkards, pirates, on an average of every 36 hours. If a ship actually arrived at its destination, merchants often had to trust in rather vague agreements made about the sale and unloading of new goods. The risk of mistreatment by local officials was always high. Arrest and seizure of goods was always a concern. And that's just the stuff involved in overseas trading. Additionally, she says, people had to worry about changeable markets, spoilage, cyclical interruptions to production, the toll taken on labor or raw materials by food, disease, or famine. We see this in an era when any number of bad things might happen to you. And so when you say the tulip is, a form of gambling because it's so risky, we have to ask ourselves, what isn't risky at this point in time? Like literally living is just a huge risk at this point in time. There's a good chance you're not even going to make it to adulthood if you're born. At this point in 1635, there's a lot of this trading going on in taverns, and the plague strikes. And it just kills so many people. It's hard to imagine. The plague actually shows up, in the 14th century, a few hundred years earlier, but people are still dealing with this thing. And this kills, like basically 1/7 of the population. Now, a lot of people have argued that the plague has kind of played into a culture of risk-taking with tulips, that, what do I have left to lose? I'm going to die from the plague anyway. Might as well buy some tulips, take some speculative risks. But it doesn't seem to have actually done that. But the plague has had one effect that's very noticeable. The plague means death. And death means inheritance, which means a lot more money flowing into the trade. This brings us to the crescendo of our story, the fall of 1636. This is really when prices start to take off, right? There are a few things that have happened. Obviously, the market has kind of grown to such a point that a lot of people are taking it seriously. A lot of people are trading it. Not in the numbers we're always led to believe, but definitely a lot of people. At the same time, the plague ends, and so this might have contributed to kind of a thrill of survival, that you didn't die of the plague. So yeah, why not go spend some money on tulips? Who cares? And so you start to see the final price rises, which really kind of go crazy over the winter. This is where, flowers that are already pretty rare and already pretty desirable basically double in price. And the ones that aren't as desirable, but they kind of need something to trade, so these kind of get pressed in the circulation, almost 12 times their price level. This is a huge rise, obviously. We see this happen up until the highest prices paid, or what's known as basically this auction for orphans at a home in Alkmaar. So a lot of the prices for the bulbs sold are normal, quote unquote, normal prices paid, but there are a few that just astonish the contemporaries of the time. You have a few flowers which go for like 5,000 guilders or 4,000 guilders. And to put that in perspective, 1,000 guilders would buy about 5,000 pounds of meat, about 13 vats of butter, 5,000 pounds of raisins. So these are really high prices that are being paid for some of these flowers. We do have to put this in perspective, right? The people who are buying are not normal people, especially with these prices. These are people who are really well off. This is definitely not an insignificant purchase for them, but it's not significant, right? Like these are people who are already making a lot every year, right? It wouldn't be weird for you to see a really rich person, maybe who has a lot of money in the bank, buy a car worth $500,000, right? You might think, wow, that's an expensive purchase, but it's not going to break your bank or anything. The auction at this orphanage is what's considered basically the highest prices paid for tulips. But what they wouldn't know is that a day before, in the city of Haarlem, an auction was held where no one bid. And the price was lowered, and still no one bid. And the price was lowered again, and still no one bid. And panic ensued. Is bursting into a gigantic fireball of tulips. When the prices start to drop, that's when the knives come out, right? Everybody starts blaming everybody else for all the problems. Almost, to me, the most interesting part of it. Next week, we're going to talk about how this thing just blows up in everybody's face. If you aren't subscribed yet, definitely subscribe so you can check that out when it comes out next week. Otherwise, if for some reason the video has already been released, who knows? Maybe it's already been a week later, then you can check the video out here. All right, guys. See you later.